Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to today's talk, The Paris End, Fashion and Photography in 1950s Melbourne. My name is Amy, and I'm from the audience engagement team here at the NGV, and will be your host for today's presentation. We are delighted to see so many of you joining us today. Ordinarily, we would begin by acknowledging that we meet on the lands of the Kulin people of Naarm, which we now know as Melbourne. For me, that is still true. However, as we are coming to you remotely today, I would like to acknowledge that many other people present in today's talk may be on the lands of other traditional custodians and pay respect to those communities wherever they are as well. We'd like to also thank our supporting partner for this programme, Sofitel Melbourne on Collins. Located in the Paris End, Sofitel is a long-standing partner of the NGV and has generously supported us in presenting many fashion exhibitions over the years as part of our broader partnership together. Our speakers today are Susan Van Wyk, Senior Curator of Photography at the NGV, and Danielle Whitfield, Curator of Fashion and Textiles at the NGV. And I am delighted to hand over to them. So over to you, Susan and Dan.
Thanks so much, Amy. Thank you all for joining us this afternoon to share a wonderful Melbourne story about a glamorous photograph, an extravagant dress, and that part of the city which is so fondly known, locally at least, as the Paris End. Situated at the top end of Collins Street, the Paris End holds a special place in the history of Melbourne. From 1900 to the 1950s, Collins Street was considered the most glamorous and fashionable destination in all of Melbourne, and arguably in Australia. As you can see in Max Dupaine's photograph, the roadway was wide enough to suggest a boulevard. The footpaths, which were at that point in time paved in grey flagstones, were dappled with the shade of plane trees, and the buildings, which were limited in height to 40 metres, were on a more domestic scale, not unlike those in the centre of Paris. At street level, like today, there were shops, boutiques selling imported fashions, beauty parlours, bookshops, and at this point, even a butcher and a greengrocer. Outside the then famous Oriental Hotel were rows of tables, chairs and jaunty umbrellas lending an air to the street that was regarded by Melburnians to be particularly Parisian. Collins Street was the place to shop and promenade in the mid-20th century. By the 1930s, it was well established as the centre of high-end fashion retail in Melbourne, and it really traded on this cultivated air of Parisian chic. During the Second World War, rationing had a severe impact on fashion retail in the street, but in that post-war boom period, the Paris End experienced a remarkable heyday. By the 1950s, the tree-lined end of the street was considered Melbourne's epicentre of style. And while this may be a little parochial, there was a great clamour about that part of the city. Describing Collins Street in 1951, a Melbourne journalist, John Hetherington, wrote, "To visitors, it is Melbourne's Champs-Élysées. To Melbourne, the Champs-Élysées is the Collins Street of Paris." He went on further to say, "I never escape a feeling of mild enchantment when I stroll from the eastern reaches of Collins Street towards the curve of the hill that swells above the heart of Melbourne. At evening, whatever the season, the eastern reaches of Collins Street are wholly lovely." To Parisians in particular, and to all of the rest of mankind in general, I have no doubt the beauty of the Champs-Élysées dwarfs, if it does not surpass in detail, the beauty of Collins Street's top end. But to the men and women who call Melbourne home, this is beauty unexcelled. That may be overstating it a little, but the precinct was wonderful. It was famously home to the fashion salons such as La Petite, Le Louvre, Hall Ludlow, and of course the iconic George's department store. Inspired by the Parisian couture houses, the Melbourne salons were opulently furnished, and they specialised in custom-made luxury and glamour for a fashionable and well-heeled clientele, and there was little shortage of them at this point in time. But it was an important business district as well, and it's worth noting that in the year 1956-57, 61% of all women's clothing sold in Melbourne was purchased in the CBD, and Collins Street dominated the sales of upmarket and expensive clothing. A number of Australia's leading photographers established studios in and around this area. Ruth Hollick, Jack Cato, Spencer Shear, Helmut Newton, Henry Talbot, and Bruno Benini all either had studios in Collins Street or worked for the fashion houses and numerous boutiques in the area. But it was Athol Shmith who was the most exciting and influential figure in Australian fashion photography. He began his career in photography in the early 1930s, and by 1932 had moved into premises at 247 Collins Street. In 1939, Schmith's business had expanded enormously, and he moved his studio up the hill, as it was called, to 125 Collins Street, right in the heart of the Paris end. The building he moved into was the former salon of the great matriarch of the cosmetic industry, Helena Rubinstein. And sadly, there are no pictures left to show the interior of the building, which Schmith maintained as it was when he moved in, because the descriptions tell us of a space that was decorated in powder blue and hot pink and must have been extraordinarily glamorous at this time. By this point in time, all the major fashion houses, boutiques and department stores in Melbourne used Athol Shmith to photograph, promote and advertise their collections. Now, Shmith was highly regarded for his portrait photography, and the image you can see on the screen, the work titled Beauty, really gives a sense of that Hollywood glamour that Shmith was able to bring to his portraiture. But it really was in the area of fashion photography that Shmith became most famous. Shmith's flawlessly glamorous photographs were perfectly suited to promoting the ideals of feminine beauty and sophistication that were embodied by the city's high-end fashion boutiques. In 1948, when Maya brought a selection of garments by Christian Dior and, most excitingly, a contingent of French models to Australia, it was Shmith who was commissioned to photograph them. His fashion illustration of Madame Chamberlain, who came to Australia in 1948 with that group of models, shows her wearing an evening gown in a remarkably opulent setting. And we believe, but we're not sure, that the setting was in fact inside Shmith's studio. In this image, Shmith has built up an image of elegant excess and a largely unattainable, but nonetheless very attractive fantasy. He also worked with local models such as Patricia Tuckwell, and in fact she went on to become his second wife and was locally referred to as Bambi Shmith. As you can see here, his flawlessly glamorous photographs were perfectly suited to promoting the ideals of feminine beauty and sophistication embodied in the Dior collection of fashion. Creating a glamorous fantasy was an important part of Shmith's work. It really underpinned the kind of work he was able to make and the dream, the illusion he could create. And it was just such an illusion, beauty and perfection, that underpins his and all fashion photographs. Having established his reputation as a studio photographer in the 1950s and 60s, Shmith increasingly began to shoot his fashion photographs on location. He talked about this later in his life and described it as being a really liberating and invigorating experience, saying, "When I go on location, even if it's just to another person's studio, I find new things and I discover new ways of showing models, and I feel better." Working this way enabled him to bring a new level of spontaneity to his work. In this photograph of the remarkable gown by La Petite, the informal setting of the garden, which is the Melbourne Botanical Gardens, is the perfect foil for the formality of this gorgeous couture garment. Describing the day of the fashion shoot, Shmith said, "This photograph was taken in Melbourne's Botanical Gardens. The woman in the photograph is Australian model Anne Chapman, who later became one of Norman Parkinson's favourite models. I remember bundling her into the back of my car in this dress to take her where we were shooting. It was a very tight fit. I suspect that's something of an understatement given the scale of this gorgeous dress. This photograph was a highlight of the 2006 exhibition, The Paris End, Photography, Fashion and Glamour. The enviable style and elegance of this gown is perfectly captured in Shmith's black and white photograph. What he did not capture here, however, was the remarkable colour of this dress. And that truly brilliant part of the story is what came next. And I'd like to hand you over to my colleague Danny at this point. Thank you.
Danny, are you
all right? Sorry,
no
there I
problem.
was talking
Love to hear your
away
voice. All
to
right.
myself. I apologize, everybody. I was just saying I really love the image of the model being bundled into the back of the cab. That's such a fantastic description. As Susan mentioned, the photograph was displayed in the Paris End exhibition in 2006 and obviously is recognised as one of Athol's most iconic images. What happened after that, though, was really a curator's dream. In 2012, the Fashion and Textiles Department received an extremely unexpected email from one of the visitors to the exhibition, and I'm just going to quote the email to you. I have an outfit that you might be interested in. It was made by La Petite in the late 50s. It is a glamorous evening outfit in a smoky blue with an ostrich feathered skirt and a hand-beaded and sequin top. It was worn by my cousin Annette Kluger, who was a singer in Australia and the UK during the 1950s and 60s. I've seen the photograph in I've seen the dress in a fashion photograph by Athol Shmith on exhibit in the gallery, which makes another interesting connection. So as you can imagine, the description gives it all away. It's immediately apparent which dress the woman was talking about. And I can tell you that our whole department was literally jumping up and down with excitement. It's pretty obvious to say this, but you know, crossovers like this are particularly rare. And I can think of only 3 other examples in the NGV collection where we have both the fashion photograph and the fashion garment. So after a phone call, we were put in touch with Annette, who, and here it is in its glorious shades of blue. So after a phone call, we were put in touch with Annette, who told us that the gown was hanging in the workrooms of La Petite when she walked in for one of her regular client fittings. At the time, Kluger was a star of the Annette Kluger show, and she was a well-known jazz singer who performed in a variety of other kind of clubs and shows. And of course, you know, as you can imagine, it was a job that demanded or, you know, required her to have these fabulous stage outfits. So she was a client of La Petite, and when she walked in, she was completely captivated by the gown's grace and its theatrical qualities. You know, she fell in love with it, tried it on, and in a true Cinderella moment, the gown fit perfectly and she purchased it to wear on stage. And one of her most memorable performances was on the Graham, when she performed live on the Graham Kennedy show in 1960 in this outfit. And I think what's interesting and just worth mentioning is because the dress wasn't commissioned by Kluger, and nor was it someone else's, you know, waiting in the salon for that person to pick up, we believe that it was probably most likely made as a showpiece by the salon, and it was probably used in one of the window displays during the 1956 Olympic year, which was a time when, you know, there was great international focus on what was happening in Melbourne and lots of, I guess, increased tourism and foot traffic up and down Collins Street. So looking at the gown, I should also just mention that it is actually a top and a skirt, but it features one of La Petite's signature elements, which is this beautiful specialty hand beading. And you can see The bodice here is decorated overall with this scrolling pattern of bugle beads and sequins and glittering diamantes. And it's really a far more elaborate work than what La Petite usually produced. In particular, when we think about this generous skirt with its bands of hand-dyed and appliqued ostrich feathers in these great sort of shaded gradations of blue. So just a bit about La Petite. It was founded by a husband and wife team, Neil and Pat Rogers, in 1940. And like many fashion houses of the era, it boasted a glamorous sounding French name. And it was located at 165 Collins Street, so halfway up the hill and just across from the George's department store. So you could say it was a choice spot. And it produced elegant day and evening wear that was designed by Pat Rogers and often based on the styles that were coming out of Paris. So at La Petite, all the garments were made to measure, and they were made from expensive imported fabrics and made with high standards of finish and control. And then the collections would be presented seasonally in-house on mannequins to receptive audiences and often reported on with great enthusiasm in the local fashion press. But as is often the case with works, historical fashion, works of historical fashion, while the garment was lovingly cared for over the decades by Annette, its age meant that some of the silk taffeta and organza fabrics that make up the gown had become fragile. So before we could put it on display or even on a mannequin, we had to undertake quite an extensive conservation treatment. And you can see here in the slide, we've got our former senior textile conservator, Bronwyn Cosgrove, undertaking treatments to various parts of the dress. In the top of the dress on the bodice, some of the ornate beaded decoration had been lost, and there were noticeable areas of wear in the feathered sections around the hip line and hem. So our gorgeous gown was scheduled for display in the 200 Years of Australian Fashion exhibition, and so the project to undertake the conservation work began a good 12 months out. And the first thing that Bronwyn needed to do was to stabilise the structural integrity of the bodice and the skirt. Then secondly, she needed to address the gown's aesthetics, and it's this later stage that involved making and integrating reproduction sequins and feathers to compensate for those areas of loss, which are visible when you look at the garment, or they were visible, I should say. So the wear to the feather decoration at the hips and the hemline of the skirt was probably the most pressing issue, as those were the areas that really detracted from this, beautiful sort of full, airy nature of the skirt. And so if we move on to the next slide, this just gives you I guess proof that conservation is a science as much as it is a kind of, handicraft. What Bronwyn had to do was to source undyed ostrich wing feathers, which she then undertook the painstaking task of dyeing them to match the original feathers. And so you can see here in the images across the top of the slide, you can see the original white feathers, the vessel with all the blue dye in it, and then a colour chart, which is just recording all the different shades of blue until Bronwyn reached the exact shade required. And I think, thinking about the dress, when you look at it, you can see that it is not a single shade of blue. So obviously, in dyeing the feathers, Bronwyn had to produce a range of blue shades to work with. And so when a correct shade was obtained, the feathers were dyed, and then once they were dyed, they were dried using a hairdryer. And then Bronwyn trimmed the fluffy ostrich barbs, which are the pieces you can see in that enlarged image on the lower corner of the screen, and assembled them into a single strip, which would then be affixed to the dress. And so in order to create this strip, she used a base of cotton embroidery thread and then secured the small sections of dyed and trimmed feather barbs using an overcasting stitch in order to retain some of the stability of the feather shaft. And if we move to the next slide, there we go, we can see Bronwyn attaching those strands of feathers into those areas of loss on the actual gown. To compensate for the missing decorations on the bodice, Bronwyn acquired thermoplastic polyester sheeting, which she then shaped and formed to make replica sequins that were then again coloured with a combination of pearlescent watercolours and acrylic paints and stitched by hand onto the bodice with fine silk thread. So quite a process and quite an endeavour, but you know, the outcome, as you can see, was clearly worth all of that effort. And of course, once the actual conservation is completed on the garment itself, we then also look to the skills of our textile display specialist, Ellen Doyle. And Ellen's someone who's responsible for creating all the historical underpinnings required for display. So when you think about, you know, the 19th century works in the collection, which might have bustles or require crinolines, or where there is, you know, a gap between the body of the mannequin and the garment that needs to be padded out or filled, that is something that Ellen will undertake. And this is where having the Athol Shmith photograph becomes so useful and so helpful, because we can see the volume and the shape of the original dress. And so using this image, Ellen was able to build a crinoline to which then she could attach tiers of ruffles. And these help bring the shape of the skirt out to its required fullness, and one that is also, I guess, you know, historically accurate for the period. And of course, none of this work is visible to the viewer when it's on display, but it is so essential to, you know, the authenticity of the work when it is on display. So, you know, a challenging treatment, but really I think this is a great work because it gives you an understanding of how, I guess, conservation is about, you know, dealing with issues of kind of composition, deterioration, and interacting with a very broad range of materials. And it is, again, that kind of, as I mentioned, that combination of science and technology and hand skills and the capacity to sort of problem solve, which makes for a very rewarding, you know, job, I think. That's, I think, it from me.
Amazing. Thank you so much, Danny, and thank you so much, Susan. So fascinating to know that there's a whole sort of backstory to many of our items that are on display. I was just wondering as well if there were any other examples in the collection where there's been this sort of crossover with the fashion photo and the garment.
Hi, Amy. That's a great question, and Danny did hint at that earlier in the talk. There are 3 examples that we have that include this fabulous Athol Shmith image, but we have a great Bruno Benini photograph of an extraordinary dress from the late 50s that we have the photograph showing Janet Dawson wearing the dress that was in fact made by her mother for Dawson to attend a ball. And similarly, the work came to the collection later on. So it's another great moment of 2 fabulous Melbourne garments and photographs coming together. But we also have a more recent example with the very well-known international fashion photographer, Tim Walker, who has photographed that fabulous red Dior coat that was such a highlight of the Christian Dior exhibition of a couple of years ago. So great moments in fashion and photography.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Susan. We do have a few questions actually that have come through. I guess the first one is quite a quick, straightforward one. Vicky has asked, is the gown on show when the gallery reopens?
it won't be because we have, I guess, a backlog of exhibitions over at NGV Australia. So when we reopen, of course, we'll, have the wonderful Destiny Deacon exhibition up for viewing. But given that it's such an iconic work in our collection, it won't be that long before it's seen again.
Excellent. And we've also got a question about how long it took to restore the dress, because obviously there's a lot of intricate detail that have gone into it. So, yeah.
Yes. Well, often conservation work is undertaken ahead of an object being selected for an exhibition. And so in this case, the work was selected for the 200 Years of Australian Fashion show. And because of the complexity of the treatment, Bronwyn began work 12 months out. So as I mentioned, first tackling, structural stability, and then dealing with the aesthetics of, missing feathers and missing beads, and then obviously making the underpinnings. So it was a 3-stage process that, and each of those stages took, quite a bit of time.
Yeah, amazing. And do we know how much the gown weighs? I've got a question about the weight of the gown.
That's a great question, and I'm afraid I don't know off the top of my head. So
that's good. Yeah.
I can say it is probably more cumbersome because of its girth than it is heavy. So that's probably the most difficult thing about wearing the gown.
And you certainly get a sense of that from that great quote from Athol about fitting the model and the wearing the dress in the back of his car.
Yeah, definitely. We've got one more question actually. So Eloise is curious about fashion photography on location in Melbourne. Are there any other similar images in the NGV collection?
Wow, another great question. Look, it's a really interesting thing that happened in the 1950s and into the 60s. So internationally, you get photographers like the then young Richard Avedon going on location with his models, and photographers based here in Australia picking up on that aesthetic which they were seeing through international fashion magazines. So from the late 50s, mid to late 50s and well into the 60s, you see many of the fashion photographers were moving outdoors, moving on location, and that's really been a mainstay of fashion photography from that time onwards. And we certainly do have wonderful examples, not only by Athol Shmith and Bruno Benini, but Henry Talbot and Helmut Newton, where they're working out on the street or in locations that they've selected particularly to highlight an aspect of the garments that they're photographing.
Fantastic. Cool. So I think we don't have any more questions now, so I might just wrap up. So I just want to say thank you so much, Danny and Susan. This is actually the second time we've run the talk because it's very popular, and what a fantastic and fascinating topic to bring back. And thank you to everyone joining us today. To those who've pre-registered for the event, we will be sending out an email survey shortly, so please share your experience with us. Want to highlight that tonight, actually, we've got NGV Friday Night In with Soju Gang, who will be DJing for us. So do tune in for that. And our next talk is up on the screen now, reading a portrait, Princess Trubetska. I definitely didn't say that right. 12 p.m. on Tuesday, the 11th of August. And we hope to see you all at another online event soon. Keep your eye on the NGV website and social media to hear about our upcoming events. So thank you, everybody, and have a wonderful afternoon. Thank you.